Okay, let's go ahead and finish up our overview by narrowing down to literature. So some of the characteristics of medieval literature. Didactic. When something is didactic, its purpose in writing is not entertainment. Its purpose is to teach. It's meant to be morally instructive, generally a spiritual lesson. So we're going to see that a lot of the medieval literature ties in with the previous slides we're talking about. The influence of the church during this time really cannot be understated. So look for things to have that moral lesson, didactic. Again, concern with salvation and the world to come. Today, in the 21st century, when we think about and we learn that the bulk of the population was in the third estate and there was very little social mobility, a lot of people that bothers us and we go, wow, how could they live that way? But people during this time, they really didn't have that much interest in social change. So we have to remember that people in a different time, they thought differently. They were okay with being, say, for example, a cobbler if their father was one, or if their father was a blacksmith, then they would become a blacksmith. So this was just part of the fabric of day-to-day life, and they were okay with it. Now, as we move from antiquity into the medieval period, we're going to see the oral tradition is still with us, but we're going to see a gradual lessening. As you see the middle visual here, the printing press is not out yet. Not that one of the key inventions that spurs the Renaissance, so it's going to happen right there on the edge of the medieval period and the Renaissance. So as we move through this 1,000 year period, we're going to see more and more books, and literacy will start to grow. But you'll notice here, the books during this time, of course, are handwritten. Yes, handwritten. So you can imagine not only the expense, but the time and the great value that books had during this period. And that, combined with the fact that literacy is still the exception, not the rule, is that the oral tradition still has its impact, because for most people, we wouldn't be able to afford or be able to read, right, books. So those would be read to us. Yeah. And then what would happen is that you would go and bump into people as you go through your day, and then you would share those stories, right, or those poems that were read to you. And so that's another take on the oral tradition, even though we start to slowly move into literacy and it becomes more and more practiced, more and more common. So the idea of silent reading is not part of the medieval landscape. People would read aloud. And here's what's really interesting. There's accounts in schools when people were taught how to read, and they were taught to read aloud, not silently. And the description was, as the person walked down the hallway and walked past the classroom door, which was open, it sounded like buzzing bees, because everybody was reading, but everybody was reading aloud, which is really total opposite of what we do today with silent reading. So, wow. Again, we have so much going on during this 1,000 years. It's really tough in a survey class to squeeze it in. So there we go with the Canterbury Pilgrims, the top visual. That's Dante down at the bottom with his Divine Comedy. There's so many other things, other wonderful parts of medieval literature. An interesting little side note, some of the great works of medieval literature come to us from the oral tradition, because the authors didn't write them down during their lifetime. Wow, that sounds like where we were with the ancient world. So, hope everyone enjoys the time between in the medieval literature, and hopefully you'll realize that calling it the Dark Ages really is kind of a misnomer. So, until we meet again, be well, do good work, and keep in touch.